Capitalism is the system of freedom. That's the claim we hear constantly. Yet from the very beginning, the type of freedom capitalism offered depended on one thing above all else: ownership. Without it, freedom meant very little. For centuries, we've been told that capitalism liberated individuals from the rigid hierarchies of feudal life. It supposedly replaced inherited privilege with merit, giving people the power to trade, innovate, and rise according to their talents. Compared to medieval society, that's partially true. Markets did open new opportunities. Trade loosened social restrictions. Wealth became more mobile. But here's the question most people avoid. When capitalism first emerged, who truly experienced freedom? To answer that, we need to travel back to the 16th and 17th centuries, the era often referred to as the dawn of modern capitalism. This wasn't a world of self-made entrepreneurs tinkering in garages. It was an era defined by empires, royal charters, monopolies, and the backing of military power. In 1600, the British East India Company received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, granting it exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies. Just 2 years later, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was formed. These weren't ordinary businesses. They were state-backed enterprises with the power to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. The first capitalist enterprises didn't operate in a free market of open competition. Governments granted them monopoly privileges, and navies protected their interests. Rivals could be suppressed with military force. Shareholders gained something revolutionary: limited liability and access to enormous profits without directly participating in the dangerous work of trade. Capital could be pooled, shared, and scaled. Ownership became abstract, and returns became scalable. But the key point is this: the freedom of early capitalism was freedom to own a stake in a monopoly backed by guns and state authority. For an investor in Amsterdam, owning shares meant profiting from trade routes, spices, textiles, and colonies without leaving Europe. For a local competitor in Asia, it meant facing armed companies that could crush your business. Capitalism never emerged as a pure expression of liberty. It was always entwined with state power. Legal contracts were enforced by courts, monopolies were defended by navies, and property claims were backed by armies. From the outset, capitalism was not freedom from authority, it was freedom structured and guaranteed by authority. This dynamic wasn't limited to the seas. On land, England experienced a transformation between the 16th and 18th centuries that reshaped millions of lives: the enclosure movement. For centuries, rural communities had relied on common lands for grazing, farming, and survival. These commons offered a form of autonomy. People could sustain themselves without selling their labor full-time. Enclosure changed that. Through parliamentary acts and private agreements, communal lands were fenced, privatized, and consolidated into large estates. Smallholders were pushed out, and traditional rights evaporated. Land that once supported independence became private property, forcing many to enter the labor market. Before enclosure, a peasant with access to commons could live independently. After enclosure, their freedom was essentially the freedom to sell their labor. Capitalism, in other words, didn't simply liberate workers, it created labor markets by removing alternatives. Freedom of contract looks very different when your previous sources of subsistence are taken away. The romantic idea of capitalism begins to crack here. Those with land and capital benefited from agricultural improvements and market expansion. Those without access to land became dependent on wages. Ownership, not labor, determined leverage and opportunity. The Industrial Revolution deepened these patterns. Factories spread across Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, powered by steam engines and mechanized production. Industrialists were free to invest, expand, and innovate. Productivity soared, and Britain became the workshop of the world. Yet step inside a factory in Manchester in 1830 and you would see a different picture of freedom. Workers labored 12 to 14 hours a day. Child labor was common. Safety standards were minimal. Wages were unstable, fluctuating with market cycles. Capitalism generated enormous productive power, but that power was unevenly distributed. Factory owners were free to allocate capital. Workers were free to accept employment or face destitution. Yet the narrative of capitalism as freedom persisted. Compared to aristocratic systems, markets felt dynamic. Compared to state-controlled economies, private enterprise seemed voluntary. Innovation was visible, and fortunes were made. But visibility can obscure structure. Power under capitalism was tied to capital ownership rather than bloodlines. Those with property had leverage. Those without navigated narrow margins. By the mid-20th century, capitalism had become more than an economic system. It had become a political identity. After World War II, the world split between centrally planned economies and market-driven ones. Capitalism was no longer described merely as a framework for property rights. It was equated with freedom itself, freedom to choose, to trade, to speak. Economists like Milton Friedman argued that economic freedom was a prerequisite for political freedom. And while private enterprise did allow for decentralization and innovation, it was never detached from state structures. Capitalism required law, enforcement, and political alignment to function. The shift was not from power to freedom, it was from hereditary power to capital-based power. Even during the post-war decades, often portrayed as a golden era of shared prosperity, ownership remained the key driver of long-term wealth. Central banks guided monetary policy. Governments invested in infrastructure and social programs. Labor unions improved wages. Regulations shaped industries. Wages rose alongside productivity. Home ownership expanded, and middle-class security increased. Yet compounding wealth still came through asset ownership, not hourly work. Those who owned factories, stocks, or land had leverage. Those dependent on wages had stability, but limited upward mobility. The 1970s brought upheaval. Inflation, oil shocks, and stagflation undermined confidence in managed economies. Deregulation and financial liberalization gained momentum, giving rise to what we now call financial capitalism. Capital markets, equity ownership, and global investment flows became central. Freedom rhetoric intensified. Markets were freed from constraints, capital from borders, and industries from government control. But these freedoms benefited those who already had assets. Consider recent decades. Stock markets and real estate have delivered substantial returns for those who owned assets. Meanwhile, wage growth in advanced economies lagged productivity gains. Those reliant solely on labor saw incremental growth. Inflation often hit wages faster than asset values. The gap between capital owners and laborers widened, not through conspiracy, but through structural arithmetic. The modern narrative of freedom clashes with reality. Anyone can theoretically participate in markets, but meaningful access requires surplus income, financial literacy, and risk tolerance. Financial crises illustrate the underlying structures. The 2008 crisis, for example, saw governments step in to stabilize institutions deemed too big to fail. Banks and executives largely retained wealth, while ordinary homeowners faced foreclosures. During the COVID-19 pandemic, trillions of dollars in stimulus flowed into markets, boosting asset prices dramatically. Those holding stocks, bonds, or real estate prospered. Those dependent on wages or fixed incomes experienced rising costs without corresponding gains. Freedom within capitalism has always been asymmetric, reflecting centuries of structural patterns. Capitalism is neither pure liberation nor pure exploitation. It is a structured system of incentives built around property, profit, and compounding. It generates opportunity while stratifying advantage. The mistake is to see it as a mythical force of absolute freedom. The smarter approach is to recognize it as a system, one that rewards ownership, protects capital, and requires political architecture to function. Once you see that clearly, slogans matter less than questions. Who owns the assets? Who sets the rules? Who absorbs the risks? Who captures the upside? These questions define your position in the system more than any notion of freedom ever could. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it patterns power. Understanding the structures of capitalism allows you to navigate markets, recognize opportunity, and see where leverage lies. If you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe. There's a lot more to uncover about money, wealth, and the forces shaping our world, and seeing the patterns is the first step to making them work for you.